impact of innovation translation. My name is Rob Demont. I currently occupy the role of translational research advocate in the biomedical engineering department at Georgia Tech and Emory. So my role is primarily to work with the faculty in the biomedical engineering department on the commercialization of their technologies, either via licensing or through startup formation. Very passionate about this space in particular. I think we have a phenomenal panel today representing two very large biotech ecosystems, the local Metro Atlanta and Georgia ecosystem, as well as some folks from our partners up in Boston and the Boston ecosystem to speak a bit about innovation and translation. Before we begin and I allow the moderator or the panelists to introduce themselves, I would also just like to make an announcement to the community at large. You will likely hear a bit about the Biolocity program. If you're not familiar with that, it is an early stage funding arm that was birthed out of the BME department. It funds life science technologies at Georgia Tech and Emory. We now have a position that has just gone live this week for associate director. And so if you are interested in a particular role regarding commercialization and entrepreneurship, I encourage you to go to Georgia Tech and look for the associate director position. With that, I think the easiest way to introduce our panelists would be alphabetically by first name. So I think, Ben, that cues you up, and we'll go through some introductions.
Sounds great. Thanks, Rob. Good morning, everyone. Ben Harris here from the Metro Atlanta Chamber. I've been on board the Chamber for about 3 years now, right at over their supply chain and bioscience practices here. And we've had a long-running bioscience practice here at the Chamber for a number of years, and it's definitely an area of focus for us. And a large part of what I do is growing jobs and investment, for the Chamber in this region. So when you think about economic development, many of the other things that the Chamber does, economic development really is probably the cornerstone of a large part of what we do. So when companies are thinking about business attraction and different places to make investments for the future, a large part of what I do is helping answer those questions. So you can think of the Chamber as kind of a corner store, concierge, as you're thinking about, where to make bets for the future for your business. So thank you for the opportunity today.
Thanks, Ben. Danish, I think that brings us to you.
Yep. Hi, everyone. My name is Danish Jamal. I work in business development at a startup in Boston called Skyhawk Therapeutics. We develop small molecules that drug mRNA splice sites. And before that, I was at a venture capital firm in San Francisco called Great Point Ventures. And as I've said before, most famously known for investing in James Allman's company, Guide Therapeutics. So that's a little bit about me.
All right, Erica.
Good morning, everyone. Erica Bechtold. I'm part of the Boston crew as well. I'm the Director of Technology Commercialization at Harvard's Office for Technology Development. My role is to support the innovation and commercialization coming out of the Wyss Institute at Harvard. So I'm excited to share more with you about that.
James.
Great. So hi, everyone. My name is James Allman. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Georgia Tech and Emory Medical School, or Emory School of Medicine. I run a lab that works on drug delivery and gene therapies, and we're known for developing DNA barcodes. But we have a startup company that's spun out called Guide Therapeutics, and I think we're best well known for being one of the companies that Danish Jamal has invested in. So, and we're based in Atlanta.
And last but not least, we have Michael.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Schroeder. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of Vaxis Technologies. Vaxis spun out of kind of a conglomerate of universities here in the Boston area. We've got inputs from Tufts, Harvard, and MIT. And Vaxis is moving into the clinic what we believe is the first combination COVID and flu seasonal protection patch vaccine. That is a shelf-stable, self-applied patch-based vaccine for COVID and flu. So looking forward to speaking with you all here today.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for the introductions. I think we'll have a conversational tone to this panel this morning. And I think a good starting point is, looking at both James and Michael with responsible for founding early stage startup companies based primarily out of university developed technologies. Could you speak to a bit about, maybe we'll start with James, what inspired you from taking a technology from a university to form a startup company and develop the technology that way as opposed to a traditional licensing route?
Yeah, I think for us, I think our idea was one of those rare ideas where you realize it could be rather large. I think you had to be honest with yourself about how good your ideas are. The vast majority of your ideas, my ideas at least, I won't speak for everybody else, but for my ideas are fine, maybe. And every once in a while, every few years, you come up with one, you go, oh, no, this is really serious. And in the case of this first company, Guide Therapeutics, it was clear that there was a need in the field of gene therapies to essentially move gene therapies outside of the liver and move them into new tissues. And we think we had a nice way of doing that. And so the opportunity within the market and the opportunity with respect to impacting patients and potentially dozens of indications over the next decade really appealed to us and made it clear that it didn't make sense to out-license. It made sense to instead create a biotech company and see if we could make a more serious company that was focused on a really big idea.
And Michael?
Yeah, so I think my journey is a little bit different. I'm a mechanical engineer by training. I had spent my entire life dreaming of designing cars. And when I came out of undergrad, I got to go live that dream with Honda and Acura. I spent a number of years designing cars there, and a couple of years in, realized that if I stopped showing up to work tomorrow, people were going to be okay. The evolution of the cars that I was working on, thrilling to me, really didn't matter much to people. The things I was working on really wasn't going to fundamentally change people's lives. So I went back to business school, and while I was at business school, came across an interesting technology that really combined a new material that allowed us to stabilize vaccines so they could be shipped without refrigeration. And we combined that new material with the new delivery technology out of MIT that essentially replaced the needle and syringe with a patch for delivery of vaccines. And it was immediately clear to me from looking at this is it had the potential to really fundamentally alter vaccine distribution and access around the world. And so that was very exciting to me. What was, I think, a bit hard and depressing for me was the realization in talking to pharma partners about how, I'll say, intimidated they were by this technology. Most of the world's best vaccine developers are very good at developing a vaccine molecule, characterizing it, producing large volumes of it, and parking it inside a needle and syringe and shipping it around the world. When you started talking about a new material and how it would look to incorporate that, and you started talking about a new device concept and how it would look to incorporate that, it became pretty obvious these pharma companies were a bit maybe overwhelmed and intimidated by the host of risks there. So I think what became obvious to me is that, there's an opportunity to positively impact the world for the better. And in order for that to happen, it's going to have to be some entrepreneurs in a startup setting that are willing to dedicate the next, 10, 12, 15 years of their lives to overcoming some of these technical challenges that, quite frankly, I think some of the other large, more established pharmas just weren't willing to do.
So I'd like to move this over to Ben to, so we've heard from sort of the inspiration for startup companies, but the startup company doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? It requires a lot of support, various sources. My question to you is, could you explain what the chamber's role, what you view the chamber's role, and what you do on a day-to-day basis to help some of these early stage companies get a footing in the environment and really be able to leverage opportunities for success?
Sure. That's a great question, Rob. And there's a number of companies that we work with who need lots of different resources, and it's hard to really put a whether it's one or two things a company needs, but I'd say there's probably a number of things. So I would say the chamber has one program for mid-stage companies. We talk about mid-stage when we talk about revenue between, say, 20, kind of revenue positive around the 10 million mark, up to about 250 million in revenue. It's a program called Backed by ATL, which is an initiative that's really designed to help scaling companies kind of in that area, because a lot of those companies are usually don't have the resources to continue to grow, in these markets. So a large part of what we do is kind of throwing the kitchen sink as far as resources, at these companies, whether it's, custom market research, trying to understand, where are good markets, for my product or service or whatever that may be. Talent availability metrics. If I'm looking for a specific type of person, around hiring and so forth, where can I find access to that talent, whether it's in, a part of Metro Atlanta, or if it's in all of Metro Atlanta, we can kind of give you a map of what that looks like. And then also I would say, connection to funding resources. I think most of us would agree, depending on, I guess, regardless of where we are, companies need money to scale and grow, and whether it's add people or resources or a building or whatever that may be. That's a large part we do, is kind of helping source those funding sources for companies here as they grow and scale. And then also, if there's, executive resources too, Rob, you think about connections, and whether you're trying to do a beta pilot or something like that with another company, you just don't know about some of those resources. So really our job is really to understand the lay of the land and be able to connect, companies like Vaxis and James's company there at Guide Therapeutics to specific opportunities like that. So I'd say when you talk about day to day, Rob, it's always a little bit different, as well as anybody. So it changes from day to day, but that's a small sampling of the types of resources that we can offer here at the Chamber.
Well, appreciate that. What's interesting about, I think, any biotech ecosystem is a source for a lot of that innovation, that inspiration, comes out of the university systems in a particular region. I think we're very strong in that regard here in Atlanta, but certainly also very strong in that ecosystem up in Boston. And Erica, I think you bring a unique perspective to this innovation conversation, right, with your role at Harvard. And in particular, you work at the Wyss Institute. Could you give our audience maybe a little bit of a primer about how the Wyss Institute works and how that might be similar or different to other arenas at Harvard and how they operate? And where have you seen success in sort of your role in beginning that early stage innovation and putting a footing for success for the projects that are coming out of your institute?
Yeah, definitely. And the Wyss Institute is such an odd but very cool place to be. So it's the Institute itself is about 11 years old. We're coming up on our 12th year. And it started through a very generous donation by Hans-Jörg Wyss, who was the chairman and global CEO of Synthes. For those of you with the medical device background in the audience, right? Synthes was acquired by J&J, and I believe Mr. Wyss owned over 50% of the company way back in the 90s when that acquisition happened. So he did very, very well and has been very successful, and he's really turned himself into a great philanthropist, both through the Wyss Institute and also through his efforts around global climate change. So when he and Don Ingber, our founding director, got together, the idea behind the Wyss was very much at the forefront of Mr. Wyss's mind, that it had to be a translational institute. He was not interested in giving money to Harvard for academic research. And really our mantra is that you can't make a difference or make an impact in society if these things don't leave the lab. And that's hammered home and really speaks to how the Institute itself was then structured, right? So the Wyss Institute is an independent 501c3 embedded within Harvard University. And what that allows us to do is, that the Wyss executive team reports up to an external board as opposed to a provost or a dean. So some of the normal politics that may occur within certain groups or schools within Harvard, the Wyss Institute, by being on this little island, is a bit immune from that. The second really unique feature about the Wyss Institute is that we're about a 400-person institute. I think we're up to 380 people. But in addition to graduate students and postdocs, a large fraction of the Institute is supported through these senior staff scientists, all of which come from industry. So this idea that you're taking people who are sort of mid to late career stage and bringing them into an institute, and these are people that have been on the research side, but also have supported regulatory, more product development, scale up manufacturing. We also have folks with much more sort of hardcore machine shop engineering capabilities, and we bring them all together in one building. It creates a really exciting environment. And so I'd say when commercial partners come in and work with the Wyss, one thing they like is that they're working with these bioengineering faculty, because we have also cherry picked our favorite and latest and greatest bioengineering faculty from in and around Boston. and then brought them into the VEAS, right? So we have faculty, Don Ingber, for instance, is tenured at Boston Children's, which is down the street from us. We have Jim Collins, who's a tenured professor at MIT. You know, we have other folks like David Mooney, who works at Harvard. All of these folks come into the VEAS, and they are actually all part-time within the VEAS while still running and maintaining their full academic research labs elsewhere. And then certainly myself, as well as a lot of the business development support that the faculty receive. You know, my job prior to this was being part of the senior management team at a small university spinout. I was at a company called Softregem Medical, right? And that was a Tufts University startup. So, you know, I certainly bring this support and perspective to both our faculty and our startups, having sort of straddled both sides and understanding the entirety of that process of academic licensing.
So, you know, that certainly is a unique perspective on that early stage innovation. I think that while not all innovation in our space is inspired or founded from a university, certainly we see a lot of the technologies that at least start to take hold in the marketplace tend to have some kind of root in a faculty member from a university. I'd like to get Danish's perspective here with your time as an investment firm. And as you mentioned, you were an early investor in your previous role in Guide Therapeutics. You know, what role do you see universities play in this innovation ecosystem? And what are you looking for when you think back to an investment perspective? You know, what are those early challenges that that you see university technologies facing? And what really would drive you to see if they've de-risked enough to make it viable for an investment? Yeah. And then I'd like to just open that up to a general conversation after Danish's answer.
Yeah. Well, I would say to the second part of that, you know, I think ironically in venture capital, it's easier to get funding for a really big risky idea than it is to get funding for a small de-risked idea. And so sometimes you'll find, you know, early stage companies and universities that either, you know, don't really understand what a venture capitalist might be looking for versus a different type of funding source, or relatedly, they oftentimes undervalue themselves. So in terms of, you know, trying to attract venture capital investment, I think you need to both have a large vision and a technology that matches that, meaning, as James was saying, an idea that's sort of worthy of being pursued on a large scale, and also maybe contradictorily the humility to know what you don't have. So, I mean, bringing it back to Guide Therapeutics, when we had met them, I don't think James certainly didn't have everything figured out at that point, but sort of presented a vision for what this technology and company could be. And you know, we tried to work together and pull a lot more other people in to help kind of build towards that story. So, you know, I would say universities certainly play a huge role in early stage venture capital and biotech venture capital. And part of it is just getting exposure to the venture community. I was certainly surprised when I finally made it down to Atlanta and went to Georgia Tech, and you know, seeing things through James's eyes and others, just the amount of talent over there and untapped potential. And I think, you know, when I think of my visits to Stanford or MIT, you know, there was just a lot more exposure for those professors and faculty to funding sources, and that helps. So I don't know if I got all your questions there, but something to start on.
Yeah, and I'll open that up to the rest of the panel. You know, what are your thoughts on that, the role that the university system played, maybe in particular in your own story, and what are the challenges? You know, I think that's an important point. I had founded a startup in the vaccine space, leaving graduate school, and the hard part is you don't know what you don't know. So for the folks in the audience that maybe don't know some things, you know, what from what you've seen, what are your experiences in that role that the university plays in some of those early challenges and de-risking that may have to happen?
I'll be happy to chime in here. I think the first thing I would say is if you're new to this, it's going to be hard. So right now we're incubating company 2 inside my lab. Getting to your question, Rob, about university support, We rely a lot on the Biolocity program to de-risk the science in the lab. My personal philosophy is I don't want to spin off 5 companies a year or whatever. I'd rather spin off one company every few years when I know it's really, like I said, worth the immense amount of time I'm going to have to put into it. So Biolocity helps me understand in my own lab space at Georgia Tech whether this idea is real enough to stand a chance. But I really want to highlight that even if you have an idea that really stands up to your own scrutiny, even when you're being very hard on it, this is a hard process. Company number 2 for us, I think, will be easier, hopefully, far easier than company number 1, because I'm going to know what I'm doing a little bit more. I mean, all joking aside, you can tell Danish and I have a bit of a bromance, but I really appreciate his willingness to invest in me early on because I was really green. And if I look at my first deck that I showed Danish, it's like he was able to see through the horrible deck that I saw that I sent over to him to a vision that I was trying to convey. So it's a bit of a catch-22 because it's really hard to understand how to make a deck or how to pitch something or who to talk to. It's hard to understand that all VCs are not created equal, that some money is more valuable than other money. All this stuff is hard to understand until you go through it. And so you have to start at some point, and it's just going to be hard. And then hopefully you learn enough lessons where company 2 becomes a little easier. So those are the 2 bullet points I'd say. Number 1, the Biolocity thing is really important within the Atlanta ecosystem, especially for Georgia Tech and Emory faculty. And number 2, go in knowing that's going to be a bit of a slog, and you're going to do a really bad job of most of the stuff until you do it when you do it the first time. And that's okay. So those are the 2 things I would highlight.
Yeah, maybe I'll just hop in really quickly and echo James' sentiment that the biotech startup ecosystem, right, is simply brutal for young first-time founders, right? This is very different from tech. I think in the world of tech, oftentimes as a young first-time founder, you can use that to your advantage. You're going to make some mistakes, but I think you can use it to your advantage that you're naive enough to go after some big, crazy sounding idea. In the biotech space, I think the reality is if you are young and you're a first-time founder, I think you have to do everything 10 times better than somebody who's got some experience, some gray hair, a couple wins, has been a part of some successful teams historically. And so what that means is that I think the university can play a vital role in filling in some of those gaps and helping you get there. So, the science, everybody has mentioned it has to be something that can be huge, and I think that's important, but it also has to have something that is got a couple of very solid, highly credentialed publications behind it, right? So that's a role the university can play in getting that science into, highly prestigious journals and really validating as well as they can in an academic environment. We were very lucky. Harvard has a facility called the Harvard Life Lab, which is essentially a lab incubator that's part of the university that is available to university students and graduates. And you have to pay to be there, but it's a much cheaper rate than many of the other incubators in Boston. So that allowed us to get some of the science into our own hands out of the academic lab. That was key for us. We were very fortunate to win about $160,000 in a couple of different business plan competitions from the university. So again, that allowed us to get some seed funding at a time when angels weren't really willing to come to the table and support us because we didn't have a track record. We built out an advisory board of 4 or 5 folks that were all Harvard affiliated. So they were willing to jump on board, not because they knew us or were familiar with us, but because we were Harvard affiliated and they liked the vision that we were going after. So that helped us get some credibility in terms of the team side of things. So I think that the moral of the story here is it is really, really, really hard for young first-time founders. And I think the university can play a pretty vital role in filling some of these gaps to at least get you close to being on a level playing field with some of those veteran entrepreneurs. Now like James coming back for the 2nd or 3rd time, when you go to a VC, they're going to give James, again, a lot more credit than they're going to give you as a first-time founder. So, having a university that's willing to help support filling some of those gaps, I think is huge.
I want to highlight, I'm sorry, I don't want to take over. I just want to highlight one other thing here, which is I agree with everything Michael just said. I want to highlight from the other perspective, from the investor's perspective, that I do think there are going to be opportunities in Atlanta, in Seattle, perhaps in Raleigh-Durham, to find faculty members that can do translation and haven't been tapped yet. And again, the reality is if you have a first-time entrepreneur on your hands and somebody who doesn't have that clout yet, and they have an idea that's X units good, you can get a better deal on your investment for those X units of upside, as opposed to going to my old advisor, Bob Langer, right? So there are some market inefficiencies. I mean that very, very specifically, like 1968 Chicago economics market efficiency. There are market inefficiencies in these types of cities where there are faculty that haven't been picked over yet. And I think that my impression with some of these biotech VCs is that they're starting to recognize that. And of course, the biotech VCs are going to look at first and foremost Boston, and then they're going to look around San Francisco, and then perhaps San Diego after that. But there are people coming around to realizing that we have some talent here, and some other cities have some talent as well. And I think that there are going to be more and more investment opportunities here because people are saying, okay, there's some talent here that other people aren't taking advantage of.
And so in thinking about that, right, again, startups don't happen in a vacuum. And when we look at the journey that startups have to take and early innovation has to take, the ecosystem has been mentioned is a big part in that. I'd like to get to sort of some of the big takeaways of what the Boston ecosystem, since that's the presence we have here today, what that has provided for both you and what you've seen for early stage innovation in the Metro Boston region. First, I'd like to give Ben an opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the things that might be going on here in Atlanta. The Global Health ATL initiative, I know, has been a big push with the Chamber, the Georgia Global Health Alliance. What are some of those things that you've seen or participated in the innovation ecosystem here in Metro Atlanta that are really benefiting our early stage ecosystem?
Thanks for letting me go first, Rob. I guess before we're talking about Boston's really truly, the mothership. We talk about, true biotech type investment, just the plethora of companies, that are there, investors, things of that nature. It's a phenomenal ecosystem. But Atlanta itself, two things that we're good at here, I would say, is health IT, or digital health is obviously what's we're really calling it more so now these days, and also global health in that nature. So you mentioned Global Health ATL. That was kind of phase one of an initiative talking about the collection of universities. The companies that are here in Atlanta are really truly based, in global health here in Atlanta. So you've got, the CDC, of course, is based here in Atlanta. You've got the Task Force for Global Health is based here in Atlanta. MAP International is here as well. The Carter Center, UPS, and Delta. While these are global, some of these are global companies, you don't think of them as global health companies, but all of them, whether you're UPS or Delta, moving things obviously from a logistics standpoint, and UPS Healthcare, basically branched off in their own division. There's a lot of synergies around global health here. So to bring all of those synergies together, we thought about, we've got all these companies that are doing a lot of stuff when it comes to global health, but we're not coordinating, any of that. So we can't. A lot of these the executives from these companies and organizations came together to put together what's called the Center for Global Health Innovation, which is being developed here in Atlanta, and it's kind of the first part of that, the Global Crisis Coordination Center, or better known as the GHC3, was launched, which kind of brings all those partners together and really connects, kind of private sector resources to the public sector and the healthcare needs for COVID-19 and other healthcare crises all over the world. So you can really think of it as kind of a global 911, if you will, when it comes to pandemics and things of that nature. So Microsoft and CDC came together and gave a large pot of money from each to start up this Center for Global Health Innovation, and more importantly, the GHC3 because of COVID. That was really kind of the main reason. Basically, they said we cannot wait to get this, to stand this up in a virtual capacity. So while that's here operating in a virtual capacity, it will be based here in Atlanta and actually have a place here, in the downtown Atlanta area where we'll have lots of different companies that'll kind of be able to coordinate, work together. And also finally some shared space also from a lab standpoint. That's never, it's always been kind of a tough part with Atlanta is a lot of the companies that have come out of universities and so forth have a great, partner, whether it's with Georgia Tech or Emory or Morehouse School of Medicine, wherever that may be. But once you kind of graduate, if you will, kind of what's the next step of kind of how you go through clinical trials and things of that nature. And that's been lacking here in Atlanta for a long time. So now we kind of finally have a true kind of runway for growth stage companies and scaling companies here.
And for the folks on the call in our Boston region, what have been, there's certainly a lot of things Boston does well, known internationally as a hub of biotech, but what are some of the key elements for the process of supporting innovative ideas in early stage startup companies? What are the key factors that Boston brings to the table that perhaps we and others across the country should be aware of as we continue to build our leading ecosystem in that space?
Michael, I wonder if you'd agree with this, or James, since you've spent some time in Boston. But I think, first and foremost, the advantage we have is geography. It's actually a very, very dense city, Boston and Cambridge. And I think what that does is really maximizes collisions between different groups of people, surprisingly so, especially within the Cambridge Kendall Square area. And I think, it's much easier for Boston to sort of leverage that when you have this high density of similarly minded people all together. It's very easy to host events and then get folks from different scientific disciplines or maybe, different groups together to sort of commingle and meet. I think the state itself has also just really made it a very big priority, right? So, at the VEAS, we have internal sort of seed funding that we can give. I sit on an advisory board to do seed funding for some of our stuff that we're incubating. But, if you don't work at the VEAS, if you work anywhere else, you have the ability to tap in as a young scientist into the state's resources, right? And maybe, Michael, you want to talk about some of those things that you guys have taken advantage of, but there are granting agencies, there's, advisory type things, different business plan competitions that are not sort of university centric that you can join. And then probably most importantly, Ben, you mentioned this shared lab space model. We have many of these types of early stage incubators and then companies that actually give away free lab space for a year. So if you're lucky enough to win some of these business plan competitions, you can even secure lab space if you're really lucky, right? So I think it's the sum total of having all of these different baskets available to you, but then also colliding enough with these other people in this world to be aware of what resources you have.
Yeah, I'll chime in here quickly. I'll give Boston 2 seconds of positive praise, and then I'll talk about all the reasons that if I were starting today, I might consider Atlanta. So first off, I think Erica touched on the single most important thing in Boston, which is, brain power. You guys, I would say, can match the majority of that in Atlanta, right? You've got some wonderful engineers and scientists that come out of there. The second part of that are experienced kind of leaders that you can pull in as advisors. And these are experienced entrepreneurs. These are experienced, folks within a drug development organization that have played various roles that you can bring on as advisors, mentors, and then eventually employees. So that talent pool is phenomenal. The reality is we live in a Zoom world now where I don't quite frankly know where many of the people we're talking to as advisors live. We just hired a new chief development officer. She's based in North Carolina. She does a wonderful job. She's fully remote. She'll come up to Boston, occasionally after we get past COVID. Doesn't matter. She can do the job just as well. So I think that Erica talked about it, that, concentration of talent is now less compelling. The other thing is the amount of money. So the state of Massachusetts committed $10 billion to the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center. We got $1 million loan from the state with phenomenal terms that we never could have gotten from a bank at the stage we were at otherwise. That was key to us. We wouldn't be alive without that funding today. They have funded other groups like there's a shared lab space. It's a nonprofit called Lab Central, and they got $10 million from the state to really get that facility up and running. We lived in that facility for 3 years as well. So I think the state has come in. There's funding through them. There's funding through groups like Mass Challenge. We were a Mass Challenge participant. That is a massive startup competition that does give out a fair amount of money, hundreds of thousands, if I think millions of dollars at this point every year. So there's some nice opportunities there. Now, the downside is because of that density, the cost of doing business in Boston is completely absurd. Lab space in Cambridge is more expensive than office space in Times Square or rent in Times Square. It's completely out of control. And again, part of that is that you've got big VCs coming in and putting 60, $80 million, Series A rounds into companies, and they're driving up the price of that real estate. If you want to be a small company and be smart and thrifty, hit some key milestones before you go out and raise that big round, it's a lot harder to do that in the Cambridge ecosystem. I think that's an edge that you guys have. The key is, as Ben pointed out, getting some of those incubators, some of that flex lab space in, so you have some options there. I think that's the biggest thing is the pricing is going to be good, but you've got to have some options. On the talent side, there's a lot of brain power here. There's also so much talent poaching. Our best scientists are getting 10 to 20 job offers per month, right? So every big company has decided they need to set up here in Boston, and they're just out here dropping offers and jacking up salaries to the point where it's really, really tough. When you as a company go through downsides, which are, kind of bad spots, which every company will, it gets tempting for your employees to look at those offers that are coming in, right? So for us to retain talent here, I think is really tough. If you've got less people poaching, there's less of a risk of that. And then I'll say the final thing that has really become frustrating to me about the Boston ecosystem is we've got a bunch of VCs that have decided instead of backing entrepreneurs, they're going to start companies internally. And so this is really the new model, and Third Rock Ventures pioneered this. They did very well with it. Now Flagship, Atlas, Polaris, a host of other companies are really going down that same road. And what that means is for a company like ours, we're really kind of a small fish in a very, very big pond. And now if I want to go out and raise money from, let's say Polaris is an example, I've got to convince them to pay attention to me instead of them spending their time and resources on starting their own company. So I do think there's some benefits to being in a different ecosystem where you may be a bigger fish in a smaller pond that may be, beneficial in some other ways. So good pros and cons of Boston for sure, in my opinion.
I think that was really well said. One addition to that, I think, my previous role when we're going around the country and meeting different companies, I think the point is you don't need to beat Boston in every category. There are like subgenres of biotech where you can build a small, powerful ecosystem quickly. Talk to James about like the Institute of Protein Design at the University of Washington. When you go over there, they have a burgeoning ecosystem within this subgenre that is competitive to anywhere in the country. So I think thinking along those lines can be one strategy.
I agree with this. I think if you just take the sum of the advantages and disadvantages, Austin is Mecca. It's just the way it is. They've been developing some of the best scientists in the world for 30 years. They've been doing the translational stuff really well for 20 years. They've had the foundation is just incredible. It's hard to match that. However, a lot of my colleagues back from my training, did start companies in Boston, and some of the concerns that Michael mentioned, I've heard regularly, in particular the poaching. And as a result of that, also the idea drift is a problem, especially when you're a small company. It's a huge problem. Why would a medium-sized company do a deal with you or even try to acquire you when they can just poach 4 of your scientists, double their salaries, and then suddenly their stuff looks a lot like yours? So I think one of the advantages that Atlanta has is that we can fly under the radar here. This is one of the things we've done at Guide. I always joke with, we're doing our A right now, and I always joke with our investors, if you go to the website, it looks like a 1995 website that we haven't updated in a year, and that's on purpose, is because we don't want anybody knowing what we've done because we don't want it. So we can fly under the radar here. I also agree that it's easier to be a smaller early stage company. My sort of rule of thumb is the moment you have to start hiring full-time pharma executives, I was head of R&D at whatever, and now I want to do a biotech, and you need those people to be physically in your company, you're going to struggle here in Atlanta. But you don't get to that point for a while. You can be before that point and do totally fine here. The scientific talent is here. to be, you know, up to a 30 or 35 FTE biotech company down here. You can do that. I think to Danish's point, last thing I'll say is that I really do agree with the subgenre idea that, you know, you can identify places or subparts of biotech where you're really quite good, and you can establish competitive companies within that subspace. And I think we have a few of those subspaces here in Atlanta, immunology, global health, and in a few years, I hope to say delivery. I'm not sure we're there yet, but you know, I think that there are some sub markets here that you can, again, take advantage of.
So hearing all of that, I think it would be useful to move on to one further subject in our last minutes here. And before we do that, I just would like to say to the audience, we're going to try to leave a few minutes at the end here for some questions. So if there's any questions you have for our panelists, please post them in the chat window, and we'll get to that in the last couple of minutes. But I think we've talked a lot about a lot of the positives, some of the struggles. But when you look at early stage technology, you know, there's this term de-risking, but there's different types of de-risking that have to occur. And for a lot of entrepreneurial, biomedical, biotech, or life science folks that are involved in the science, they primarily think of the technical risk with their technology. But you also have to look at things such as market risk, and in our space, regulatory risk. You know, I'm reminded of a conversation I had early on in my startup experience where we found out from the head of immunology for Pfizer's global division that our value proposition didn't fit their needs. Didn't matter that our vaccine works in an animal model, it's that it didn't fit their financial priorities, right? So can you speak a little bit, perhaps for some of our entrepreneurial folks in the audience, you know, what are some of those landmines that may not be so apparent to the folks that are really focused on just the technical risks that you've seen through your experiences?
I do want to say one thing here. I had a conversation with a person, at least in who does biologics. So I'm not saying this applies to devices or anything like this or small molecules. Super well-respected guy in biologics. We were just having this conversation the other day, and I was asking him what kind of risk he thinks is really like the predominant risk. And he said for the majority of the biotech companies that they invest in, he's at a huge fund, a multi-billion-dollar biotech fund. They look almost exclusively at technical risk. And if the technical risk is low, then they will take a glance at the market stuff and all these things. But for therapeutics, their perspective is that almost all therapeutics fail, and therefore the majority of the risk is the technical risk. So I think the risk question depends on what stage you're at. If you're an early stage company, honestly, I think the technical risk is still predominant. Once you're a Series B company and you've raised $150 million in total, and 40 of that is going towards the clinical stuff, then you might have to start thinking about market and things like this. But I do want to highlight that when you're early, I think the definition of risk is likely to change in early upfront, at least in therapeutics. My understanding is that technical risk is really, really predominant. Just want to highlight that.
I agree completely with that. I would rephrase the question slightly as, you know, I think this is something that our young entrepreneurs struggle with, right? Because there is market risk, there's regulatory hurdles and risk. And sometimes I think that you can get slated down one lane, and it's hard to sort of rise above that and think more strategically about markets that you really should be tackling, right? We find this at the Visa a lot, right? Where there are these passion projects for certain markets that, you know, are very underserved or are maybe smaller markets. And it's hard to support some of those projects effectively because they think, well, to be successful, don't I have to raise venture capital in sort of the traditional sense? And isn't there only this one pathway for me? And so I find that sometimes people can get very hung up on that, right? And that's a bigger struggle.
I think expanding on that, it's been said earlier in this panel that the funding sources are sometimes thought of like monolithically, like venture capital as an industry or other forms of capital. And what you'll find is, even though every website might look the same, something about changing the world, the reality is every firm is a little bit different, calibrated a little bit differently to what their sweet spots are. And as it pertains to risk, it's almost one of those things you can talk yourself out of any investment because everything's risky. It's inherent to what we're all doing. And one of my colleagues used to say, we're looking for companies with a sense of inevitability to them. And I always liked that saying. So I think it's about trying to find something so exceptional in one of those categories that you're willing to forgive, the inherent risk that is coming from the other ones. And I think that exceptionality often comes, as Michael said, in terms of a repeat successful entrepreneur. That's the most common. But I also think if you're solving a big enough problem, then like a known problem in the field, and have data to support that can forgive a lot. So that's my 2 cents.
So I'll leave the opportunity one last time for some questions. If not, I've got a pertinent topic, switching gears just a little bit. So again, if you have a question in the last 4 or 5 minutes here, please post it in the chat. But until I see that, I think top of mind right now, we uniquely occupy a space in the biotech and life sciences in the current COVID environment, right? So where some industries are seeing a decline, we don't necessarily see that. So I'd like, any of the panelists' perspective on what you have seen in the industry, whether it be from hiring or from a perspective or an investment perspective in this current climate with the pandemic, and how have you seen the pandemic affect those things in our industry?
I can speak a little bit to that. I think that the V's, when we shut down in March, we have a machine shop and injection molding capabilities and sort of heavy duty engineering. We pivoted almost completely to being all in on supporting the pandemic, right? And really encouraged a lot of our folks to pivot in that direction, whether it be manufacturing nasal swabs, face shields, making new diagnostics, to, Dr. Ingber does a lot with organ chips, right? So he built out a sort of organ chip model to screen for, a pseudovirus of SARS-CoV-2 and look for drug repurposing and see if we could accelerate anything in the therapeutic development process. I think in conjunction to that, Harvard made a decision fairly early on with MIT and Stanford that we would do free 1-year licenses, completely free, to any COVID-related technologies coming out of our institutes, through December of next year. And so that's also been really, really impactful. I personally have helped support, maybe 7 or 8 of these licenses at this point. And we do, we have many more in the hopper that we're working on. I think it's also been a really nice thing to be a part of, but also really important, for companies that can jump in quickly and have pivoted themselves to helping support the pandemic. It's a great way to sort of try out an adjunct technology and see if you can pivot and make a difference, So I'll just stop there and see if anyone else has anything to add.
So I'll just hop in here. So our company name is Vaxxas, which stands for Vaccine Access. That's been our mission from the start, is improving vaccine access around the world. It's been amazing to hear for 8 years from every single investor that we talk to that we should take our platform somewhere other than vaccines, right? Because vaccines are an unfundable area. You see maybe 1 to 2 venture deals in the vaccine space every year. All of a sudden, COVID comes along, and I'm getting multiple calls every day from all of my friends and other therapeutic companies saying, hey, we think we can do something that's vaccine related with our platform. Can you teach me about vaccines, right? We saw the market cap for companies like Novavax, a publicly traded company, go up 23 times what it was pre-COVID, right? So all of this has been really, I'll say, fascinating and weird for us to watch. And we just continue to chug along. We've added a COVID program into our existing flu program. But I think the moral of the story for us was we knew, and many others knew, not just us, but we knew that there were going to be future infectious disease outbreaks that would cause massive issues for people, and developing platforms that could address those was a worthwhile endeavor. Companies like Moderna, many of you may be familiar with, again, now a $30 billion company without an approved product, which is pretty amazing to me, but they've been developing this mRNA platform that was hyper responsive, and they could turn it on a dime when a new emerging threat came. So I think the moral of all this story for me is that if there is a problem out there that's big enough, go train your guns on solving it, try and find a way to address it. And to some extent, you're going to have to brush out or ignore some of the feedback you'll get from venture investors who say, this is not a hot space, we're not investing here. Forget it. If it's a big enough problem, people are going to notice at some point in the future. The good thing for us is there are a ton of non-VC funding sources out there that you guys can lean on to support the company. So we've gotten more than $18 million in non-dilutive funding into the company since we started it. I talked about some university business plan competitions, some from the state of Massachusetts. We've got active grants today from DARPA, BARDA, the NIH, NSF, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and NASA. So all of these different organizations have been very supportive in helping us push that platform forward. So I think the one thing to remember here is go find a big problem, find a creative way of solving it, and eventually you're going to catch people's attention and get them to pay attention to you. Don't go chasing the trends based on one or two feedback discussions with, you know, a couple of VCs or angel investors.
Got it. Well, I just want to take the opportunity to thank all of our panelists. Really immersive conversation and informational. So thank you for taking the time, and thank you to the Georgia Bio folks, Courtney, for helping us with our panel, and Maria and Christina and Elise and all you've done to assemble our conference this week. And with that, I'll say thank you to our audience as well. And you know, hope everyone has a good rest of the day and a good rest of the conference.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Everyone.
Thanks.
Bye,
Uh,
everyone.